January 28, 1986. Millions of people tuned in to watch history being made. The Space Shuttle Challenger was moments away from launching into the heavens, carrying 7 brave astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher chosen to travel into space. Families gathered around televisions, classrooms stopped to watch the event live, and NASA prepared to inspire a generation. But just 73 seconds after liftoff, the unthinkable happened. In a flash of fire and smoke, Challenger disintegrated before the eyes of the world. Shock turned to silence, and silence turned to grief. It was one of the darkest moments in the history of space exploration. In the years since, countless documentaries and reports have examined what went wrong technically. The O-ring failure, the cold weather, and NASA's fatal decisions. But one haunting question has lingered, whispered about, but rarely discussed openly. What really happened to the crew inside Challenger? What became of their bodies after the explosion? The truth is complex, heartbreaking, and far different than what many assumed in those stunned first moments. Today, we're going to explore the final moments of the Challenger's crew, the recovery efforts that followed, and the painful reality behind one of America's greatest tragedies. The final moments of the Challenger crew. The Challenger disaster was one of those events where time seemed to freeze. The image of the shuttle breaking apart against the clear blue sky was burned into memory, replayed endlessly on television screens. For most watching that day, it appeared as if the crew had perished instantly in the violent fireball. But the reality, revealed in the months and years that followed, was far more complex and infinitely more tragic. When Challenger lifted off at 11:38 a.m. on January 28, 1986, there was no sign of what was about to unfold. On board were 7 astronauts: Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialist Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and teacher in space Krista McAuliffe. They were calm, professional, and ready to begin their mission. The launch seemed normal, but the freezing temperatures that morning had already sealed their fate. The solid rocket booster's O-rings, designed to keep the hot gases inside, had stiffened in the cold. Just over a minute into flight, those O-rings failed. A bright flame appeared on the booster, burning through the external fuel tank. Seconds later, the Challenger broke apart. To the millions watching, it looked like an explosion. But technically, Challenger did not explode in a ball of fire. Instead, the shuttle tore itself apart as its external tank ruptured, sending the orbiter into catastrophic aerodynamic forces. The vehicle disintegrated at around 48,000 feet, scattering wreckage into the Atlantic Ocean below. What then happened to the crew inside? This question has haunted families, engineers, and historians alike. NASA's official position in the immediate aftermath was cautious. They suggested the crew likely died instantly, but as recovery efforts began and evidence mounted, it became clear that the crew module, the forward cabin of the shuttle where the astronauts sat, had survived the initial breakup largely intact. In other words, the astronauts were alive after Challenger came apart. The crew cabin detached from the orbiter and continued on a deadly trajectory for more than 2 minutes, plummeting toward the ocean. The cabin remained pressurized for at least part of the descent, and evidence later showed that some of the astronauts had activated personal emergency oxygen packs. These PEAPs could only be turned on manually. The fact that several were found activated proved that at least some crew members were conscious and aware after the breakup. The most haunting detail was the evidence that pilot Michael Smith may have attempted to restore control during the descent. His switch panel was found with settings altered from their launch positions, suggesting he was trying to regain power or control systems as the cabin fell. Other switches near Commander Scobie were also moved. These findings indicate that the Challenger crew did not die in the fireball seen on live television. Instead, they were alive for the terrifying fall of more than 2 minutes, fully aware, powerless, and descending toward certain death. The cabin struck the ocean surface at over 200 miles per hour, an impact far beyond survivability. It was this collision, not the breakup in the sky, that killed the crew. The knowledge of this reality is almost unbearable, especially for the families who hoped their loved ones never felt the fear of those final moments. But the evidence suggested otherwise. For NASA, this revelation was devastating. The agency had insisted for years that the shuttle was as safe as any aircraft. often quoting odds that minimized the risk. Yet here was proof that not only had a preventable failure doomed the mission, but the crew had endured an unimaginable ordeal before their deaths. What those 2 minutes were like inside the cabin can only be imagined. The astronauts had trained together, laughed together, and shared the dream of spaceflight. In those final moments, they were likely calm, doing what astronauts are trained to do, trying to assess, trying to act, trying to survive. Commander Scobie and Pilot Smith may have worked their controls while others checked on each other. The teacher Krista McAuliffe, who had captured the imagination of classrooms around the world, was in the midst of the nightmare. These were not faceless figures in flight suits. They were human beings experiencing the unimaginable, and they faced it with courage. The tragedy is magnified by how preventable it was. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had warned of the risks of launching in such cold weather. Some pleaded with NASA not to launch that morning, citing the vulnerability of the O-rings. But in the culture of NASA at the time, one of deadlines, public pressure, and a desire to prove the shuttle program's reliability, those warnings were dismissed. The decision to go ahead cost 7 lives. For the public, the Challenger disaster was a moment of horror. For NASA, it was a reckoning. But for the families of the crew, the revelation of their loved ones' final minutes was almost too much to bear. The idea that they had survived the breakup only to fall helplessly into the Atlantic compounded the grief. In time, NASA would honor their memory with tributes, scholarships, and memorials. Schools and institutions across the country bear their names, but no tribute can erase the haunting reality of those final 2 minutes. The Challenger crew's deaths were not instantaneous, not painless, and not the fiery end seen on television. They lived through the disintegration they fought to survive, and they faced the final descent with the courage that defined their lives. That truth is both heartbreaking and profoundly human. The recovery of the crew module and bodies. When Challenger's crew cabin struck the Atlantic Ocean, the impact was catastrophic. Traveling at over 200 miles per hour, the cabin slammed into the water with a force estimated at more than 200 Gs, far beyond what any human body could withstand. For the 7 astronauts inside, death was instantaneous upon impact. But the story did not end there. What followed was one of the most difficult and secretive recovery operations in NASA's history: the retrieval of the wreckage and, most hauntingly, the remains of the crew. The search begins. In the hours after the disaster, recovery ships, aircraft, and Coast Guard vessels converged on the area off the coast of Cape Canaveral where debris rained down. Hundreds of pieces of Challenger, large and small, floated in the ocean. At first, the mission was focused on finding clues to explain the accident. But soon, search crews realized they were also looking for something even more painful: the crew compartment. Over the following weeks, divers scoured the ocean floor, combing through wreckage spread over thousands of square miles. It was a grim task. Debris was scattered and often mangled beyond recognition. Parts of the shuttle were pulled to the surface, marked, and shipped to secure facilities for analysis. NASA wanted answers about the technical cause of the disaster, but the families wanted something else: closure. They wanted their loved ones brought home. The cabin is found. It wasn't until March 1986, nearly 6 weeks after the disaster, that search teams located the shattered crew cabin. It had sunk to the ocean floor about 100 feet deep, not far from the other large sections of Challenger's wreckage. Navy divers described the moment as sobering. Here, beneath the waves, lay the final resting place of 7 astronauts who had captured the world's imagination. The cabin was badly damaged, compressed, and twisted by both the aerodynamic breakup and the violent ocean impact. Yet inside the wreckage, recovery crews began the most heartbreaking part of their mission. Human remains were discovered within the wreckage of the cabin. The recovery of the astronauts. Over the course of several days, Navy divers carefully extracted the remains of the crew. Out of respect for the astronauts and their families, NASA and the U.S. government released almost no details at the time, and much of what was learned later came from investigative leaks and testimony. What is known is that the remains were badly fragmented by the force of impact and the violence of the crash. Identifying each astronaut required meticulous forensic work. The remains were placed into sealed containers and transferred to NASA facilities, where forensic teams worked with dignity and precision to confirm identities. Dental records, DNA, and other methods were used where possible. In the end, all 7 astronauts were accounted for, though the condition of the remains was such that exact details were kept private to spare the families further anguish. The secrecy NASA faced an impossible balance. The public demanded transparency, but the families of the astronauts deserved privacy. As a result, information about the crew's recovery was classified and kept from the public eye. For years, only vague statements were released, noting that the remains had been found, handled respectfully, and returned to the families. In reality, the secrecy also served another purpose: to protect NASA from further criticism. The fact that the crew had likely survived the breakup and been conscious during the fall was already devastating. To release graphic details about the recovery of their bodies risked turning tragedy into spectacle. NASA chose silence, shielding the public from the most painful aspects while honoring the dignity of the fallen. The family's grief. For the families, the recovery brought both closure and new pain. They had to come to terms not only with the loss of their loved ones, but also with the grim details of how they had died. Some families later expressed anger at NASA for not preventing the disaster, pointing to ignored warnings about the O-rings and the pressure to launch despite dangerous weather. Others chose to focus on their loved ones' bravery and sacrifice, using their memory to inspire educational programs and scholarships. Krista McAuliffe's presence on the shuttle made the grief especially public. She had been chosen as the first teacher in space, a symbol of inspiration for children across America. Schools had watched the launch live, and many children had to process the trauma of seeing their hero die. For her family, the recovery was a painful reminder that Krista's dream had ended in tragedy, but also a chance to lay her to rest with dignity. The burial. After the recovery and forensic identification, the remains of the Challenger crew were returned to their families for burial. Each astronaut was laid to rest according to their family's wishes, some in private family cemeteries, others in public services attended by thousands. Arlington National Cemetery became the resting place for some of the Challenger crew, where their graves remain a solemn reminder of the risks of exploration. In addition to individual burials, a special monument was created at Arlington, the Space Shuttle Challenger Memorial. Here, the names of all 7 astronauts are etched in stone, honoring them as pioneers who gave their lives in the pursuit of knowledge. The memorial serves as both a place of remembrance for the families and a symbol for the nation of the price of progress. The hidden truth. Though NASA remained quiet about the condition of the crew's remains, over the years, fragments of information surfaced. Investigators confirmed that at least some of the astronauts had been alive during the fall. Personal air packs were activated, switches in the cabin were moved, and evidence pointed to awareness until the final impact. For the families, this was the hardest truth of all, that their loved ones may have faced the final 2 minutes in terror, unable to change their fate. Yet, despite the horror, many also found comfort in knowing the astronauts likely acted with professionalism and courage until the very end. They were trained to face the unknown, and in their final moments, they did what astronauts always do: they tried to survive. By the summer of 1986, the recovery operation had concluded. Wreckage from Challenger was stored in sealed silos at Cape Canaveral, where much of it remains to this day. The crew had been laid to rest, but the scars of the disaster lingered. NASA's silence about the recovery of the bodies left questions unanswered, fueling rumors and speculation. But for the families, the privacy was a shield, a way to grieve without the world dissecting every painful detail. The Challenger crew did not vanish in the sky as many believed. They endured the unimaginable, and their bodies were recovered from the depths of the Atlantic with as much dignity as possible. It was a painful process, but it allowed the families and the nation to finally say goodbye. The legacy of the Challenger crew and NASA's reckoning. The Challenger disaster was more than just a moment of national grief. It was a turning point for NASA, for space exploration, and for how a nation confronted the cost of reaching for the stars. The recovery of the crew's bodies and the grim truths uncovered in the aftermath left scars that time has never fully healed. Yet from that pain emerged lessons, reforms, and a legacy that continues to shape human spaceflight. The national grief In the days following January 28, 1986, America was plunged into mourning. Schools had been watching live when Challenger broke apart, making the tragedy uniquely intimate. Children saw their teacher, Krista McAuliffe, vanish in the sky, and parents struggled to explain. President Ronald Reagan, in an address that evening, tried to give words to the grief. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. He spoke of the crew as pioneers, reminding the nation that exploration comes with risk. But for the families, grief was not symbolic. It was personal. They had lost mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and friends. The official ceremonies, the national outpouring of sorrow, and the monuments were meaningful, but they could not replace the loved ones who never came home. The recovery of the crew's bodies brought some closure, but it also forced families to confront the agonizing truth of how their final moments unfolded. NASA's reckoning. For NASA, Challenger was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning. The shuttle program had been sold to the public as safe, even routine. A space truck that could launch frequently, carrying satellites, experiments, and even civilians. NASA officials spoke of 1 in 100,000 odds of failure, numbers designed to reassure, but completely unrealistic. The Rogers Commission, an independent investigative body, revealed the devastating truth. NASA knew about the O-ring problem in the solid rocket boosters long before Challenger's launch. Engineers had raised red flags, especially about launching in cold weather, but management overruled them. The pressure to maintain schedules and the desire to please politicians and the public created a culture where risk warnings were buried. The Commission's findings were damning. They pointed to a flawed decision-making process and criticized both NASA and Morton Thiokol, the contractor for the rocket boosters. Challenger was not lost to bad luck. It was lost to human failure, a cascade of ignored warnings, poor judgment, and misplaced priorities. For many, this was harder to accept than a technical error. It meant the deaths of the crew were preventable. Changes and reforms. The fallout forced NASA to ground the shuttle fleet for nearly 3 years. During that time, sweeping changes were made to address safety and decision-making. The booster rockets were redesigned. New safety protocols were introduced. NASA created the Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance, ensuring that dissenting voices could no longer be ignored so easily. Astronaut training was updated to include more emergency scenarios. But beyond technical fixes, Challenger also transformed NASA's culture. The loss of 7 lives was a reminder that every decision carried weight. Astronauts were not just crew members, they were husbands, wives, parents, and children. That understanding pushed NASA to take human safety more seriously than ever before. The families fight for legacy. The families of the Challenger crew did not let the tragedy end with mourning. They became advocates, educators, and guardians of the astronauts' legacy. Perhaps the most enduring creation was the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, founded by the families. Their mission was clear: to inspire future generations to carry forward the dream of space exploration. Across the country and around the world, Challenger Learning Centers allow students to experience simulated space missions, igniting curiosity in science and technology. In this way, the crew's lives were not defined solely by their deaths. They became symbols of inspiration. Krista McAuliffe, in particular, remains an icon for teachers and students. Scholarships, schools, and programs bear her name, ensuring that her dream of bringing space into the classroom lives on. The crew as individuals. Remembering the Challenger disaster often focuses on the event, the explosion, the wreckage. But the crew were more than symbols. They were individuals with dreams, talents, and families. Francis Dick Scobie, the commander, a decorated Air Force pilot known for his steady leadership. Michael Smith, the pilot, father of 3, remembered for his humor and dedication. Judith Resnick, mission specialist, only the second American woman in space, an engineer with brilliance and determination. Ellison Onizuka, mission specialist, the first Asian American in space, who spoke of inspiring children to believe anything was possible. Ronald McNair, physicist, saxophonist, and mission specialist, who grew up in segregated South Carolina and overcame barriers to become an astronaut. Gregory Jarvis, payload specialist, dedicated engineer, eager to make his first flight into space. Krista McAuliffe, teacher in space, chosen to represent every classroom in America, who planned to teach lessons from orbit. Each had a story. Each had a future cut short. To reduce them to a single moment of tragedy is to forget the fullness of their lives. The Challenger's lasting impact. Challenger changed how the world viewed spaceflight. The shuttle program eventually resumed, and missions continued for decades, but the aura of invincibility was shattered. Astronauts were still heroes, but now the public understood the fragility of their missions. Challenger forced a global conversation about the cost of exploration. In 2003, when Space Shuttle Challenger was lost on re-entry, killing another crew of 7, the lessons of Challenger were revisited. Once again, culture and ignored warnings were partly to blame. And once again, the names of fallen astronauts were etched into memorials alongside the Challenger 7. Challenger's legacy, therefore, is twofold. It is a cautionary tale of how arrogance and mismanagement can lead to disaster, but it is also a testament to courage. The courage of those who board rockets knowing the risks, and the courage of families who turn grief into inspiration. What really happened to the Challenger crew's bodies is painful. They survived the breakup, endured the fall, and were recovered from the ocean with dignity. But what happened to their legacy is equally important. They became a symbol, a warning, and a source of inspiration. Their story reminds us that space exploration is never without danger, but also that human beings will always reach higher, no matter the risks. The Challenger 7 live on not just in memory, but in every student who dreams of the stars, in every astronaut who boards a rocket, and in every scientist who dares to push boundaries. They are gone, but their legacy ensures that they will never be forgotten. The Challenger disaster was not just a technical failure, not just a moment caught on live television. It was 7 lives lost in the pursuit of discovery. Behind the images of fire and falling debris were human beings who lived through terror, fought to survive, and were finally recovered with dignity from the depths of the ocean. Their story is heartbreaking, but it is also a reminder of the price of progress and the courage it demands. The truth of what happened to the Challenger crew's bodies is not easy to hear. It strips away the myths and leaves us with the raw reality of risk, sacrifice, and loss. But if we only see tragedy, we miss the larger legacy. The Challenger 7 continue to inspire classrooms, space programs, and dreamers around the world. Their names live on not just in memorials, but in every rocket that launches, and every child who dares to look up at the sky and say, "I want to go there." So now we ask you, do you believe the lessons of Challenger have truly been learned, or could history repeat itself? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories of history and exploration.